The first sound Silver Creek ever awoke to was the ringing of Noah Carter's hammer, and the last thing most folks noticed about him was the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, twisted and pale against sun-browned skin, a mark left by a wildfire that had swept through the valley 12 years before and taken his family's barn, his father's life, and nearly his own. Long before the church bell called the faithful to prayer, long before the ranch hands saddled their horses and the mercantile swung open its doors, the windows of the blacksmith shop glowed orange against the black Wyoming sky, and the steady rhythm of iron striking iron rolled down through the valley like a heartbeat the whole town depended on without ever thanking the man who gave it. He was 39 years old, broad through the shoulders from a lifetime of honest labor, and he had long since stopped expecting the world to look past his face to whatever might be underneath it. Children who passed his shop on their way to school walked a little faster. Travelers who stopped to have a horse shod stared a moment too long before catching themselves and looking away, embarrassed, as though the scar itself had caught them staring. Noah never said a word about it. He had learned that silence cost him nothing, while explanations only invited more questions he had no wish to answer. And some nights, lying awake long after the forge had gone cold, he could still hear the roar of that fire, the way other men remembered gunfire or thunder, a sound that never fully left the body once it had lived inside it. He remembered his father's voice calling his name through smoke thick enough to swallow lantern light, remembered the beam that had come down between them, remembered waking 3 days later in a stranger's spare room with half his face wrapped in linen and no father left to bury properly, only ashes and a burned Bible that had somehow survived. At 39, he had built a life out of what remained, an honest trade, a small house, and the particular peace of a man who no longer hoped for much beyond a fair day's work, and he would sit alone at his small table some evenings, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and wonder, the way a man wonders about weather he cannot change, whether he would spend the whole of his life this way, respected for his work and avoided for his face, useful to everyone and known by no one. Nearly 2,000 miles to the east, in the crowded, coal-smoked streets of Cincinnati, a woman named Anna Whitmore was folding the last of her belongings into a single weathered trunk, her hands moving with the practiced economy of someone who had learned to travel light because life had given her little reason to gather much. She was 35, and 5 winters had passed since she had buried her husband, taken from her by pneumonia during a cold spell so bitter the ground had to be broken with picks before his grave could be dug. She had never told anyone, not even her closest friends, that in the last fevered hour of his life he had gripped her hand and asked her to promise she would not spend the rest of her days alone out of loyalty to a dead man, and she had promised only because she thought it would ease his passing, never truly believing she would have to keep her word once the grief settled in and made a home for itself in her chest. Since then, she had spent her days bent over a sewing table, stitching fine dresses for women who paid her wages without ever learning her first name, and her evenings alone in a small rented room, listening to the clatter of wagon wheels on cobblestone and the laughter of families through thin walls, wondering if this was the whole shape her future had been carved into. It was on a rainy afternoon, while she waited out a downpour inside the public library with nothing to occupy her hands, that she came across a newspaper folded open to the advertisements, and one notice in particular stopped her eye and would not let it go. It made no promises of wealth. It offered no flattering description of a handsome rancher waiting beneath some big and generous sky. It simply read that a blacksmith in the Wyoming territory was seeking an honest companion, that he owned a small home and earned a fair and steady living, and that his face carried the marks of an old fire, and that if appearances mattered most to a woman reading these words, the notice asked her kindly to pass it by, but if kindness mattered more, he invited her to write instead. Anna read it 3 times before she folded the paper and tucked it into her sewing bag, thinking of a promise made at a deathbed 5 winters past, a promise she had let gather dust the way a person lets a debt gather dust, hoping it might quietly forgive itself with time. It never had. She wrote to him that same week, and for 3 months letters crossed the country between them, slow and patient as the changing seasons, filled with small, honest things, favorite books, long winters, the ache of loneliness neither of them tried very hard to disguise. And by the time September brought its first cool mornings, Anna had sold what furniture she could not carry, said her goodbyes, and boarded a westbound train with her trunk and very little else, riding day and night toward a man she had never seen and a town she could not have found on a map a season before. When the train finally slowed into Silver Creek and released its long breath of steam onto the platform, Anna stepped down to find nearly half the town gathered to watch, drawn less by welcome than by curiosity, for everyone wanted to see with their own eyes whether the Eastern widow would take one look at Noah Carter's face and turn straight back onto the train. Noah stood beside his wagon at the edge of the platform, holding his hat in both hands, turning the brim slowly between his fingers, his stomach twisting tighter with every second that passed. When Anna's eyes finally found him across the platform, he braced himself the way he braced himself every time a stranger's gaze reached his scar, waiting for the flicker of surprise, the polite effort to look elsewhere. It did not come. She looked directly at him, not around him, not through him, but at him, the way a person looks at someone they intend to know. And then, unhurried, she smiled. "You must be Noah," she said, and he found his voice long enough to answer that he was. "I have traveled a very long way," she told him, "and I do hope you will not make me carry this trunk on my own." For a moment, Noah could only stare at her, and then, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he laughed, a real laugh that came up from somewhere he had thought long closed off, and the crowd began to drift away in 2s and 3s, quietly disappointed there would be no spectacle to carry home and repeat over supper. Life together did not arrange itself into anything like ease in those first weeks. They were 2 strangers sharing one roof, bound by letters and by vows spoken before a traveling preacher rather than by long familiarity. And there were evenings when conversation came easily, evenings when silence sat at the supper table like an uninvited guest. Neither of them knew how to ask to leave. But Anna was a careful observer, the sort of woman who noticed things other people walked past without seeing. And what she began to notice about her husband was that he could not seem to leave a broken thing unmended. A neighbor's sagging gate, a widow's cracked stove, a loose wheel on a wagon belonging to a family who could not have paid him if he had asked. When she finally asked him one evening why he gave so much of himself away for nothing, he only shrugged, as though the answer were too plain to need saying, and told her that someone had once helped him when he had nothing at all to offer in return. He did not say who, and something in the way his jaw tightened told Anna the answer belonged to a part of him not yet ready to be spoken aloud, so she let the silence stand and did not press him further. Autumn folded into winter, and snow settled thick and white across the valley, and one afternoon Anna carried a cup of hot coffee across the yard to the blacksmith shop and stopped in the doorway at the sight before her. A small boy sat on an overturned crate beside the forge, watching sparks rise and scatter in the orange light, his coat patched at the elbows, his boots plainly a size too small for growing feet. "Who is your visitor?" she asked, and Noah told her this was Ben, and Ben, without a trace of shyness, announced proudly that Mr. Carter made iron birds. Noah looked faintly embarrassed and said they were not much, but when Anna lifted the small metal robin resting on the workbench, she found every feather carefully shaped, every curve finished with a patience that had nothing to do with usefulness and everything to do with love. "They're beautiful," she said, and Ben grinned up at her and told her that his mother said people only made beautiful things if they had beautiful hearts inside them.
Noah turned quickly back to his work, and Anna saw, before he could hide it, that no one had spoken to him that way in a very long time. Spring came at last, carrying with it the particular hope that only a Wyoming spring can carry after a hard winter. And for a while it seemed as though the Carters had settled into something steady and good. But trouble has a way of finding even the quietest corners of a life, and it arrived that year in the shape of the town banker, who announced before a gathering of local businessmen that he intended to bring modern machinery in from the city to replace Noah's forge, insisting there was no good reason to keep the old ways alive when progress could be purchased and installed in half the time. One of the men standing near him added, loud enough for the whole room to hear, that customers might well prefer dealing with someone easier to look at, and the words hung in the mercantile air like smoke that would not clear. Noah stood very still, and after a moment he reached up and began untying the leather apron from around his waist, saying quietly that he supposed they were right. It was Anna who stepped between her husband and the men gathered there, her voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. "No," she said, "they are not right. They are afraid that one honest man might make the rest of them look small." For a long moment nobody spoke, and then an old rancher named Silas Odell rose slowly from a bench near the back of the room, and what he said next was something even Noah had never once heard spoken aloud in 12 years of living among
these people. Silas said that the winter after the wildfire, when Noah lay half-burned and grieving in the ruins of his father's house, with no money and no will left to rebuild, it was Noah himself, still bandaged, still barely able to stand upright, who had walked 3 miles through snow to shoe Silas's lame mare for nothing, because Silas could not afford the trip into town, and his family needed that horse to survive the winter that followed. Noah had never told a living soul, not even Anna, and Silas said he had kept silent about it all these years only because Noah had once quietly asked him to, not wanting pity from anyone, but that he could not stay silent now and watch this town repay a debt like that with cruelty dressed up as progress. One by one, other ranchers rose from their seats and added their own small, unspoken debt. A wagon wheel mended at midnight without being asked. A widow's roof repaired the very week her husband died, until the whole room stood full of quiet kindnesses nobody had known belonged to the same scarred and silent man. The businessmen left without another word, their plan dissolved, not simply by loyalty, but by the sudden weight of a truth Noah had spent 12 years trying to bury as deep as his own grief. That evening, Noah sat alone on the porch steps as the sky turned the color of a dying ember, and when Anna came to sit beside him, he admitted, his voice unsteady, that he had never wanted anyone to know what he had done after the fire, because if people saw kindness in him, they would ask him to speak of the burning, of his father, of things he had spent 12 years trying not to remember. Anna took his rough, scarred hand in both of hers and told him she understood something of carrying a promise nobody else knew the weight of, and for the first time she told him about the deathbed vow she had made and had very nearly broken by staying alone too long, out of a grief that had felt, for a while, like the only loyalty she had left to give. "We are neither of us as unbroken as we pretend to be," she said softly. "And perhaps that is exactly why we were meant to mend each other." His eyes filled before he could stop them. "I do not know why you chose me," he said. "I did not choose a scar," she answered. "I chose the man who filled his letters with kindness instead of bitterness, the man who walked 3 miles through snow and asked for nothing in return, the man who still shapes every horseshoe with care because he knows some family's safety depends on it." She reached up then and touched the scarred side of his face, the side strangers so often looked away from, and told him it was proof he had survived, not proof that he was broken. For the first time since the fire that had taken his father and changed his face forever, Noah did not flinch when someone touched that side of his face. He simply closed his eyes and let himself, after 12 long years, finally rest. The years that followed carried Silver Creek through the kind of slow, ordinary change that no one notices until they look back and see how far the road has come. Children who had once hurried past the blacksmith shop now crowded around its open door in the evenings, waiting for the small iron animals Noah shaped from leftover scraps of metal. Ben grew tall and steady, and on the morning he turned 20 and set out to start a small ranch of his own on the edge of town, he walked into the shop before dawn, before Noah had even lit the forge, and asked, quietly, if the man who had once given away so much for nothing would teach him to shoe his very first horse with his own 2 hands, so that when he hung those shoes above his own stable door, some part of Noah's hands would always be in the work he had built his life upon. Noah stood at the anvil beside the boy he had watched grow from a patched coat and 2 small boots into a steady young man, guiding his grip on the hammer the way no one had ever guided his own after the fire. And for the first time in a long while, he wept quietly while he worked and did not turn away to hide it. And Ben, understanding without needing to ask, simply let him. The town, in time, forgot how quick it had once been to look away from a scarred face, the way towns often forget their own unkindness once enough seasons have passed to soften the memory. But Noah never forgot the autumn afternoon a stranger stepped down from a train, looked past 12 years of scars to the man waiting underneath them, and chose to stay. And he never forgot the winter evening his own town finally learned who he had been all along, not because he had told them, but because kindness, kept long enough in secret, has a quiet way of finding its own voice in the end. On warm summer evenings for many years after, neighbors passing along the road would see Noah and Anna Carter seated together on their porch, watching the Wyoming sunset spill gold and rose across the mountains, and more often than not, the 2 of them sat in comfortable silence, needing no words at all, because some understandings run too deep for talking. Some love stories begin with a handsome face and end when the years slowly wear that face away. But the ones worth remembering, the ones told to grandchildren by a warm fire long after the people in them are gone, begin the moment someone chooses to see the heart first and never once looks back. If this story touched your heart tonight, take a moment to subscribe and light the bell, because there are so many more stories like Noah and Anna's waiting to be told. Stories of quiet courage and second chances that this old world does not tell often enough. If you believe love sees deeper than any scar ever could, leave a comment and let us know, and share this story with someone who needs reminding that they are worth choosing. Every subscriber helps keep these frontier hearts beating for a whole new generation of dreamers. It illustrates how communities can be swayed by fear and prejudice toward those who look different, and how a single hidden truth, spoken at the right moment, can undo years of silent misjudgment. It honors the historical reality of mail-order marriages on the American frontier, arrangements built not on romance alone, but on shared honesty, mutual need, and the slow, patient construction of trust between strangers who each carried their own private grief. Above all, it offers a gentle reminder, timeless and still needed today, that character revealed through consistent, quiet service will always outlast first impressions, and that true partnership is built not on flawless appearances, but on loyalty proven through years of small, faithful, and often unseen acts.